This session is outside of the box, looking at inclusive leadership differently. And with us, we have John, Sally, James, and Brooke, who will introduce themselves shortly. But just firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands in which we all find ourselves today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Just a couple of housekeeping items. As I mentioned, it's recorded. The session will also be transcribed. But then feel free to also pose questions via the chat, or even feel free to, you're more than welcome to have your video on if you'd like to show us your wonderful faces. And yeah, don't hesitate to ask us questions throughout. We do have a few pre-prepared questions, but we can also be adaptable as well. So just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Madeleine Marie Judd. I work as the Student Partners Advisor at the University of Queensland. And this session, I was talking to one of the leads of this diversity fair, my colleague Krista, and she said, let's do like an amazing session. So I was thinking about it, and this topic of leadership kept on coming to mind. And I thought, well, let's assemble a group of human beings from throughout Australia who I admire and respect for many multiple reasons. So they were very kind enough to share some of their time and their perspectives with us today. So firstly, I'm going to get them to tell us a bit about, tell you a bit about themselves and their current role, and how did they think they get to where they are now. So to start us off, if it's okay, I might start with the Reverend Dr. John Kappa to introduce himself.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Madeleine Marie. I just hope the clouds help give the right sense when you give me the Reverend Doctor introduction. It's all a bit overwhelming, frankly. It is always sunny in Melbourne, where I live, but as someone has pointed out, sometimes the clouds get in the way. But I think that's the metaphor I like to try and live by. I'm a Sydney boy living in Melbourne. I was a chemical engineer, trained at the Uni of New South Wales, and studied theology, was ordained as an Anglican minister in, goodness me, 1985, worked in the bush. But since 1989, I've been involved in theological or ministry education. I retired last year as Director of Learning and Teaching for Australia's smallest and only specialist university, the University of Divinity, which is Melbourne-based. And since retiring, I've been asked to take on a role as Academic Dean of one of our colleges. So I'm doing that, having quite a bit of fun back in the front edge of working with students and staff and institutional development stuff. So that's probably me in a nutshell, because I'm a nut, basically.
Thank you so much, John. And all of these wonderful panelists that are with us today are incredibly humble human beings. And one word that I would use to signify John is just joy personified. So much so that he even did his PhD in joy, and is one of the most compassionate human beings out there.
Well, I just note, by the way, that joy is much easier to spell than any other theological concept. So it's just, it's pragmatic, really.
Wonderful. James, I might flick over to you now to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is James Avanatakis. I'm a researcher and educator and currently the Pro Vice Chancellor of Engagement at Western Sydney University. I haven't always been an educator. I started my life working in finance. I worked in finance for about 10 years. And then I went and worked in human rights organisations for about 5 years. I ran those organisations. I was the first member of my family to go to university, which has always been was a really exciting thing for me, but a very difficult journey. I just got back from living in the United States for 12 months. I got back about 4 months ago on a Fulbright fellowship. So I'm glad to be back in the country of gun control and socialised medicine. So I look forward to hearing everybody else talk on this panel.
Fantastic. Thank you, James. And James is one of the most enthusiastic, fun people there are out there. And I'm very fortunate to have him as one of my PhD supervisors. So I specifically wanted James above anyone else in all of Australia to be my supervisor, and was very lucky that he said yes. Brooke, can you please introduce yourself?
Me, yes. Hi, I'm Brooke Szucs, no titles. I'm a recent graduate from a Bachelor of Arts, and I'm currently on a gap year teaching English in Japan, which is where I am now and for the foreseeable future. And I've been really involved in student representation and partnership, and just kind of getting involved in the diversity space while I was a student. I'm looking forward to getting back into it. And Madeline Marie said many nice things about all the panelists here, and I think it's worth pointing out that she is a wonderful and very empowering leader who has made a big difference to my student journey, coming from a place of kind of imposter syndrome and stuff. So I think we should recognize that as well.
Thank you, Brooke. And I'm so sorry that I'm adding all these introductions to it, but these people are too humble. So I've been fortunate to collaborate with Brooke for a couple of years now. And she can't seem to shake me. We're still collaborating, even though she's not at the university, but incredible, insightful and constructive feedback. And yeah, so thank you very much, Brooke, for joining us. And last but not least, the wonderful human, that's Sally, who is also known as the Kift.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Madeline Marie. And I'm humbled to be on the panel with these amazing people as well. So I'm Sally Kift. I'm also like James. I was a first in family student at university, low socioeconomic background, worked 3 jobs to put myself through uni, and got there because my parents had aspirations for my future life and well-being. I studied law, which I realise now, which is a bit late, was probably the wrong thing for me to be doing, but I think I acquired some skills and ways of thinking about things that I've used then and subsequently to adapt to different careers. I practiced as a lawyer for a few years doing court work, but realised pretty quickly that wouldn't work for me as a parent of young children, so changed career tack and became an academic. In a law school with greater flexibility as a fractional appointment. I was about 60% for most of the years while the kids were little. You shouldn't ask them how that worked out, but anyway, that's what I did. I've worked at 4 different unis and morphed from, I suppose, lawyer to legal academic to managerial roles with an emphasis on learning and teaching and the student experience, because that's the bit that really interests me, and moved into more senior roles as an institutional director of first year experience, and then most recently as Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic. I currently doing my own HE, higher education consultancy work, but now that all the money's dried up, that's going very well for me. So I've just become a grandmother again recently, so I've just spent a lovely couple of months with a new grandson. And I suppose the insight from all of that I would take is I've tried to fit my life, my career around my life circumstances, especially as a parent of young children at the time and then moving states, and have always pursued what's intrinsically interested me, which is around student experience and educational opportunity as a common good. And I've tried not to be afraid of going backwards occasionally when you need to move forwards, if that makes sense, as your personal and work life interact.
Thank you so much, Sally. And as I mentioned, you know, it's definitely a real honour to have all of these panellists, and Sally has been and continues to be and will be in the future as well, a sector leader and a strong and advocate for student success, transition, and diversity as well. So thank you all. So to go into the first question of what does diversity mean to you, and what has been some of your experiences with diversity? So why do you think it's a particular important topic, whether it be in the context of higher education or even in the world of work beyond the university sector? So I might, if it's okay, go to, unless someone in particular wants to address the first question, definitely not James. John, would you?
Sure, Madeline Marie, we've put ourselves in your safe hands, so I'm happy to trust your lead. Look, 2 or 3 brief comments if I can. I had the weird experience when I trained as an engineer that at that time, chemical engineering, which I did, was part of applied science. And so we actually had a 50-50 gender mix. which was astonishingly different to the engineering faculty. But I was kind of aware still of the blokiness that was there in spite of the gender balance, and that was sort of interesting. And my involvement at UNSW with the Christian Union was of a female leader who didn't particularly want to do the upfront stuff, so I did the upfront stuff. And of course, everybody assumed that because I did that, I was the one who knew what was going on. It just wasn't the case at all. In the midst of that, at that stage, UNSW was almost unique in requiring general studies of people like me in the engineering faculty. And so I did some stuff that was fantastic. I did stuff on cinema. I went, wow. And a unit on gender studies. In those days, it was just called Man and Woman, which was probably a good description of how we saw the world at the time. But it just opened my eyes remarkably, and that was fantastic. So then it probably changed the way I worked as an engineer with Shell, but it certainly changed the way I engaged as a student when I started studying theology. So Wendy, my wife, and I, we'd been married for a year at that stage, maybe 2 years, and we joined the movement for the ordination of women. So I was in an Anglican college. Women still were not ordained anywhere in the world, really, in the Anglican Church. And Wendy is a strong Christian leader. We were part of that movement because we believed in it. Never really expected to see change happen, frankly, as quickly as it did. So our daughter, born in 1984, was born just before women were ordained in Australia, but is now an Anglican priest. And for her, that's just normal, you know? So I kind of believe in change, but I also believe you've got to agitate and get engaged in that area of change. So briefly then, when I was first ordained, I was sent to an area where in the town and the area, 50% Aboriginal people. And, you know, I learned enough through cultural studies, which I knew I needed to do, to recognize the sociality of two Aboriginal communities, those who are in the town, those who are on the reserve, but also at least two non-Aboriginal communities, those in the town and those on the land, and within them all sorts of subdivisions, and start working out what it meant to be an urban professional in a rural world was for me really life-changing. And I realized that I could start to understand different people's worlds, but the first step was to know I had questions, not answers, and to spend a lot of time listening. So that's kind of where I went, and since then I've become a bit more energetic, I think, in advocacy around gender, marriage equality. It's come at a cost occasionally. Wendy and I are proud parents of 4 daughters who keep me on track. So I don't know if that sort of says a lot about diversity. I actually did deliberately move from Sydney to Melbourne to a college to work with a female principal. So although I had been principal of colleges, smaller colleges, that was a great step. Challenging step, not understood by everybody, but for me, you know, very enriching, and glad I did it. Is that enough for a start?
Thank you, John. And I think that's a really poignant statement that you made in terms of it's not necessary, it's about not having all the answers, and ensure it's that whole concept of lifelong learning and always questioning and knowing that, you know, that's the process of life. So Brooke, did you have anything else to add in terms of how, like, what's your experience with diversity, and why do you think it's such a valuable thing as well for us to think about?
Definitely, like for me, when people look at me, they kind of see the shiny necklaces and the good manners, or whatever they like to call it. And I've always kind of seen myself as being on an even playing ground to other people, and not realizing that I have a lot of invisible diversity in that sense. I come from an immigrant family. I was the first in family to go to university, low socioeconomic status, lots and lots of things from that area, you know. And always for me, when I talk about diversity, the first thing I think of is my identity as a student, and how that differs from the good student. From growing up, you know, I was always kind of the worst student. I was distracted, I was a pain, you know, my teachers probably didn't like me all that much. And I got into the University of Queensland with an OP 13 with special consideration for all my issues. And when I started at the university, I felt very, very strongly that I did not belong there, that I was automatically the least intelligent, the least prestigious, and that no matter what I did, that wasn't going to change. Everyone around me was automatically better. And that really reflected in my grades and my engagement. And as I've been going through the university life cycle, I was realizing that, first of all, there are a lot of people like me and who were actually often hiding it and kind of masking themselves to fit in, which is something I've definitely been doing. And second of all, that not being that perfect student and having everything right, that actually having diverse input and experiences actually can really bring up the people around you. So I've come from being really disadvantaged and really struggling at university to making it my point to relate to other people who are struggling, to recognize what I dealt with and where that could have been better, and enacting that. I don't know if you want a personal story or not.
Oh, I think that's, yeah, it's incredibly powerful. And I think it comes back to that concept of empathy, and, you know, similar to what John was saying in terms of always asking questions and being inquisitive rather than making presumptions on people's lived experiences as well. Sally or James, was there anything else that you'd like to add to that question?
I might just jump in. So this week I was part of a team from Diversity Arts Australia that released a report looking at diversity, or the lack of diversity in the news media, looking at the 5 major channels, and we did a survey of the I suppose the ethnicity of the of news presenters, hosts, talent on TV. And we asked the question of, the report was titled, "Who Gets to Tell Australian Stories?" And it was very specifically titled that because, you know, the thing is that we are a very rich, diverse culture, you know, going back to the First Nations people and the many languages and cultures and histories that they shared, to the, you know, the arrival of the process of colonization and the waves of immigrants. We've become this really rich society, but there's many stories, you know, as Brooke was saying, there are many stories that you see of people, and for me, diversity is not only the richness of the fabric of our contemporary Australia, but also accessing that fabric. There's no point that fabric being there if we don't see it and we don't access it, and we don't you know, tap into that vein. And that's what I think, you know, if I jump ahead about what I find empowering when I, you know, working with people like Sally and colleagues, and you know, and hearing John speak, is that it's about how do you tap into that fabric, and that fabric is so powerful, right? And hearing and there is nothing more empowering than people, you know, seeing themselves reflected in the classroom, be it the educator or colleagues, or seeing themselves in leadership, seeing someone like them in leadership positions. And I think, you know, our role in promoting diversity is to not only promote leadership in those spaces, but also help create an environment where that tapestry is accessible. And I find that is one of the things. And I you know, this is where I think, you know, looking at a Freirean approach, where everyone in our classrooms has a story to tell and a story worth listening to, and we as educators can learn from those stories, as can other students in that classroom. So for me, you know, diversity comes in so many different dimensions, but it's such a powerful process to be able to tap into that diversity, make sure that it's that people can access it, make it visible. Without doing that, then I think people can be excluded. I think it's a loss of a resource, one of the most powerful resources that we have. And I think that's why a panel like this is so important, so we can discuss, how we need to continue to make sure that we drive to have those stories heard and included.
Thank you, James. And yeah, definitely a few kind of key themes coming from that in terms of role modeling and opening up that dialogue with, whether it be the students and staff members in a classroom or more broadly as well. I don't want to limit your perspective, Sally. So was there anything else that you would like to add to that?
So just a couple of things, and I wanted to congratulate James. I hadn't realised you were involved in that report. That's been a huge report this week for us and really shone a light, and those sorts of discussions I think are so fundamental. It just makes everyone step back for a minute and think about that. So I had some diversity for me. I was just going to do very quickly 3 particular perspectives. One, much like Brooks, as a first in family student at university, I felt very other, a quintessential fish out of water, thanks Dr. Seuss. I thought everyone was better, better off, better dressed, better informed, better connected. And I didn't seem to understand a single thing that was going on, and very keenly felt with my state school education that I couldn't actually pronounce any words that I had to use at university. So that was tricky. And then I'm adopted, and I found out about 20 years ago that I'm half Greek, James. So, you don't know what you don't know to a large extent. So there's that piece. But I also thought it might be worthwhile pulling out gender diversity for a minute as well. So when I did law in the 70s, yes, that long ago, old people, women were still in the minority at law school. So around about 30%, which is quite different than what it is now, where they're about 60 or 70%. And then you graduated into a very male-dominated profession. And as you will have seen more recently from the big discussion about sexual harassment and discrimination in the legal profession, still a very masculine profession at its core. So there's that aspect and how you make your way through that path. And also law is well known for its serious mental health and wellbeing issues, both at university and in the profession. So there's that aspect to diversity. And then the other point that I was going to make about diversity from my perspective, which we see on a daily basis, and I think you see just on the screen here, is the increasing diversity of the student cohort. So as higher education's moved from an elite to a mass sector, our cohorts have got much more diverse. And that's been a bit of a passion of mine for the last couple of decades, trying to think about how a higher education could be, the experience could be a better and more inclusive one for all students, which has required a big shift in our thinking. And also for the labour markets that our students are entering. I mean, we're educating more diverse cohorts. How are the professions and the employers shifting in that regard also? I think there's a lot that we can all do to help smooth that experience. So I just come back, I think, in terms of insight to that invisible diversity. And you really can't make any assumptions, excuse me, about people and their diverse circumstances. And invisible diversity is writ very large. So there's really needs to be time taken to develop that relational understanding, which is so important, and particularly in an increasingly automated world, where emotional intelligence is a uniquely human trait and can't be automated. And there's usually a backstory to everybody, no matter who they are. So taking time with that and thinking about how you do that interpersonal relational piece in your current and future life, I think is quite important, and having the diversity hat on or voice on your shoulder or in the back of your head. That's all.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Sally. So also just to say as well for our wonderful participants that have joined us today, please don't hesitate to ask any questions that you may have via the chat. I'm sure our panelists would love to hear some of your questions, or even if you want to share your own personal story, please don't hesitate to. But just in the meantime, the next question that I have for our panelists is, what does the term inclusive leadership mean to you? What does it take to be an inclusive leader? I might start with, because Sally's just talked, so I'll give you a break, Sally, if you want. James, you're not shaking your.
Sure. Look, I think inclusive leadership, is I think captured perfectly with what John said, which is not assuming you have the answers, just being willing to ask the questions and being a listener. I think that's what inclusive leadership is, and not being afraid to just say, I don't know, so there's situations where I had someone in my class who was really, really severely disabled, and to the point that I had never could imagine. I had no idea what her education experience was going to be like. So I just sat with her and I said, "Tell me what you need. Like I have no idea. I don't want to sound dumb. I don't want to sound naive, and I probably will, and I don't want to, use politically incorrect language, which I probably will, but I just don't know. I don't know what your experience is like. So what do I do to make your experience inclusive? Like, what do you want from me?" So just be willing to admit that you don't know, and also to ask, what is it, and to ensure that to ensure that we that people are included in those discussions. I really believe in this concept of brave spaces, not just safe spaces. For me, a safe space is important, but a brave space is also creating our environment where people are willing to ask uncomfortable questions, and including to us as being the educators. So I think they're the two things that I would say inclusive leadership is picking up on John's point, where you just say, I don't know, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions, and then also creating an environment where people can also ask questions around you, and you don't make them feel like idiots for asking those questions. And I think you don't want to create an environment where someone doesn't ask a question, because we as educators, if those questions aren't asked in our rooms, in our classrooms, however they're defined these days in the world of COVID, they're going to be asked, they're going to be discussed in a bar or a pub or with your family or in a cafe. And if you exclude people from having those conversations in your classroom, then that's not inclusive leadership.
Thank you so much, James. And what are your thoughts, John? What does it take to be an inclusive leader?
My head's just spinning with the sense of brave, James. I have a friend, and we journey together. We meet every few weeks, who was rejected from studying in a number of places, but ended up and rejected by the college I was at from studying counselling because she has cerebral palsy. So her communication is very difficult, but she was allowed to study theology. And I think Stevie created brave spaces for us by the fact that enough people were willing to listen. And one of the great things, and I say seriously this, a great thing about Stevie and other friends I've had with CP is you've got to slow down to listen to them. And every word they make, which is so much harder to get out than it is for me, is worth listening to. And she says, "Oh, you're such a great mentor." And I think, no, it's not that way at all. It actually is the other way. Sort of reflecting on this recently, walking with a little granddaughter. Is she holding my hand or am I holding her hand? Am I guiding and supporting her? Or is she guiding and supporting me? I can tell you more often than not, she leads me. And that's the case with my friendship with Stevie, by the way, who is a social advocate and a performance poet. So head around that. We had a friend who's blind except for 1% vision in one eye, who was a professional photographer. Now, he never would have been unless people had supported him and given him the chance. And I think it is that stopping and listening. And I think these people do create brave spaces. But I think we help curate them. Spaces are always co-created and co-curated. So those of us who find ourselves in power position, which teachers do, need to name these things. I remember years ago doing a session on mixed mode in education, diversity or something or other. And I made the comment that every class is a mixed cohort. There may be some who are online and some in class, maybe some undergrads, some postgrads. There may be some visual learners and some, I don't know, whatever, kinesthetic learners. But the key is, what do we learn from each other? It's much more important for me to learn in a mode that's not my normal mode, because that will actually help me to be a more inclusive person. So it's not just about applying labels which are about disadvantage, but actually finding that diversity is about this splendor of variety and mixedness. Gerald Manley Hopkins talked about dappled things, and I think that's the joy. Things are not smooth and plain. It's that sort of dappleness. I don't know. Years ago, I got asked to teach a unit in feminist theology, which may sound odd, but I'm a feminist. But the tragedy was that all but one of the students in that class was female. And the male student, when I pressed him on it, well, he didn't have any other choices. It was the best unit. He didn't actually want to do it. So the danger is that we made gender into a female problem. It's not. Gender is a human issue, and disability is not a problem for the disabled. It's a problem for all human beings. Do you know what I mean? And left-handedness is not only a problem for my one left-handed red-headed daughter, it's an issue for all of us, because there's a different way of engaging the world. And I just keep learning and discovering, and I haven't got any answers, sorry, but thanks for letting me speak.
No, thank you, John. I think that's a really important point to make. We're all in this together at the end anyway, and we can learn so much from each other. I might go to Sally now and get her thoughts on what does being an inclusive leader mean to you.
So I was going to answer this very tritely by saying, you've got to be inclusive, and you'd be surprised how rare that is. And I think the vision of what's inclusive has to be really broad. And when we've seen that, I think, in the responses from James and from John. And I suppose what I mean by that is in whatever, and you can exercise leadership wherever you are. I'm a very strong proponent of that. But I think it means being inclusive of people with diverse backgrounds, as we've just spoken. So because they bring different perspectives to yours and can be enormously helpful and informative in that way. It's also inclusive of diverse disciplines. And I say that with love, coming from my profession, law, which has got a bit of a reputation for being so insular. So there's much to be learnt from cross-disciplinarity. And again, to put this in the careers frame, that's increasingly important now in the world of what they're calling hybrid jobs, where you need the tech skills in combination with creativity and entrepreneurship, the business acumen, teamwork, adaptability, all those 21st century skills that we keep hearing about. But also diversity when you're in the workplace with different parts of the organisation. So in the university environment, but where I've been obviously most familiar for the most recent times, but inclusive of, excuse me, winter and a cold, junior to senior ranks across the organisation and different parts of the organisation. So to be inclusive, you've got to include IT, the data analytics people now, the human resources people, and of course, obviously in learning and teaching, the learning, teaching and assessment different remits. The other piece I think about inclusive leadership is to try and mentor and pay it forward. So I, support people as you've been supported. Undoubtedly, everyone has and seeks out their own mentors and has been supported. I think the way you honour that support is to pay it forward. So I spend a lot of my time doing that now, writing referee reports, advising and mentoring others for what that's worth. And you can do it in different ways. So I also curate now a national learning and teaching short series, and that presents a lot of diverse perspectives. So it's killing two birds with one stone if you're into bird killing. So it's putting the diverse perspectives out there, but also a concrete expression of your support of diversity by enabling diverse colleagues to put their position where they might not otherwise get a voice. So I suppose I'm just suggesting again, you can exercise leadership and inclusive leadership in particular from wherever you are by doing the joining up, the linking up, the promoting of anyone and advising and assisting others, whatever your role is. So if you take a very broad view of what inclusivity is and its relevance in it for you, and your career trajectory and motivation, you can learn a lot from diversity of perspectives, if that helps.
No, thank you, Sally. And I love that tangible example as well of the paying it forward and mentoring others, because I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. And I know that, you know, for myself, I wouldn't be where I am today without, you know, an incredible range of people that have mentored me in different ways and perhaps don't even know that they've mentored me as well. So Brooke, was there anything that you'd like to add in terms of what does it mean to be an inclusive leader?
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to start by seconding everything everyone has said. There's really some good insights and things I would have kind of shared myself. I think that's all really excellent. And to kind of share, like, personally what it means to me, it was kind of recognizing these challenges and barriers and things like that that went to me, and seeing how that affected my cohort, especially the cohort that was disadvantaged in various ways, and working to remedy that. And then extending it to people who don't have the same experience as me. And one way for me doing that was that I really put myself out there. I've made it very, very clear that I'm not your typical student, that I do have these labels and these issues and whatnot, and making myself a very approachable person in that sense. And especially as a student representative, that really helped to get students who wouldn't, like, there's a big difference in approaching someone who you only see the GPA 6+, you only see how they dress so well, you only see that they're so accomplished. But when you kind of show the baggage underneath that and what you had to drag to get there, you're so much more accessible. And I really think that we, as the future leaders, as current leaders, need to really take that with us, because people are in these positions, but they hide it, they mask it, and they haven't been bringing people up with them in that sense. They've been camouflaging. And I think that if we kind of really put ourselves out there like that and open ourselves up, that will perpetuate a really good cycle. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Brooke. And if I may be so bold as to add something also to this question in terms of what it means to be an inclusive leader, one thing I particularly think is important is to acknowledge the expertise and the contributions of those around you as well, and always openly acknowledge that. And sometimes that might embarrass them, but it comes with good intent, because, you know, even as a little tangible example of the Student Staff Partnerships program at UQ, none of that would be possible without the hundreds of students and staff members at the university who co-created that, and through people like Brooke, who sat on our operational group last year and really pushed us in a really great constructive way to be really, you know, asking those challenging questions of diversity and of inclusion. And I think it's so important to acknowledge those people, that because, you know, it takes a village in anything that we do in life. So just a couple of thoughts for you there.
Hey, Maddie, can I just add something as well? Sorry, just quickly. Sorry, Sally.
No, Madeline, I was just going to say we've got a question in the chat from Fran around this, so we might come back to that, but after James has made his comment.
All I want to say, the other thing I was going to say is it's also, you know, and again, just picking up a bit on what Brooke just said as well, is that it's also can be a bit messy as well. Like, in the sense, it's not always easy to deal with this, and that's part, you know, again, and what you said, you know, there's so many people around that have all this great expertise, but negotiating, you know, making sure that people are inclusive is not always an easy process. And it can be a bit messy. And I think that goes back again to what I said about brave, you know, having those brave spaces where you're willing to kind of go, okay, we got that wrong, but let's talk about how we can do better, because you're not going to get it right every time. You're just not. So yeah,
thank you for bringing that up, James. I think that's a really important thing to bring to the fore. And we've got a fantastic question from Fran. Thank you so much. So she has asked, I would love to know a bit more about your perspectives on what does it mean to be an inclusive leader in terms of people from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, and what could be done to ensure people from different countries feel included and can also have leadership positions. So was there anyone in particular on our panel that was busting to say something?
Look, I'll are you pointing at me, Sally? Look, I'll jump in because, you know, I've mentioned the media diversity report, and actually it's been really cool because the media diversity report is built on the work done by the former Human Rights Commissioner, Tim Sapomasan, as well as work done by Diversity Arts Australia, which did a very similar report with the arts industry. And look, I think there's a few things I think that are really, really important, and that is diversity in leadership positions doesn't just happen, right? And that's because structurally there are reasons why it doesn't happen. And so I think part of it is actually confronting those structural inequalities that exclude people and understanding it. And that is everything from what John said about people with cerebral palsy, but also people from cultural and linguistic backgrounds, where you get this issue where you may have hiring practices, or you may have processes which make people from cultural and linguistic backgrounds excluded, either through unconscious bias or through other processes that can happen. So part of it is to actually be very, very conscious of implementing inclusion processes, and then I think once you do that, and that can be you know, for say in leadership, that can be anything from ensuring you know, people having a program whereby you reach out to communities, but in a classroom setting, you also have to recognize that some people from cultural and linguistic diverse backgrounds, they're not going to participate in the discussion the same way as other people are. Some people may not have the confidence, or they may not have the similar background where those discussions are easily accessible, are usually encouraged. So you actually need to make it happen. You actually need a conscious strategy to make it happen. And I think, you know, in a classroom setting, for me, it's actually specifically working with people before class, sometimes during class and after class, to give them the tools to engage in debates. It's as a leader, you know, the advice that we provide to organizations, be it media or arts organizations, is to actually have targets and actually create an environment where you reach out to communities. It's actually a really interesting, once you get that process, and, you know, and I think of other nations in other parts of the world, actually we can learn from, where they actually have specific strategies to reach into communities and include them, and we need to be good, get better at doing that.
Thank you so much, James. And I've just got another kind of question brewing in my head, but I don't know if we're going to have the time for it, so I'll just kind of add it to the list. But, you know, how do we actually move beyond tokenistic practices of inclusion? I feel like, Brooke, are you busting to say something?
Completely, absolutely. Well, kind of, I feel like I can add to both of those from my perspective, because first of all, I am also from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. I'm a Hungarian immigrant family, and I very much understand, you know, English isn't my first language and things like that. So I come from that same background, but I've had a lot longer to adjust to it. So I can only sympathize with what a lot of international students, for example, are currently going through. But I think there's a lot of ways that are tangible and a bit more intangible that we can really work on. So if you go for more of those big ideas first, I think it's, again, there's a theme here of bringing other people up with you and doing that. Like, if you're a diverse person, or even if you're not, in whatever that means, if you are really making the effort to identify those people around you that are achieving and really encouraging them, that in itself really helps. If you're a person from those kinds of backgrounds, I think also advertising that in the sense that we are also really worthy, that we can also achieve so much, is really helpful to bringing up people that we don't know, that we don't directly contact with, because that you're a role model for someone, you're not an icebreaker, you're a mold breaker for someone else. as a child, I had my name changed to an Australian name and things like that. And when I grew up, I made the effort to go back to my roots and to really connect with that, in that sense that we are, you know, that I am still Australian and that I'm still English speaking and I can do all of these things. But in a kind of smaller sense, in a more direct sense, something that Madeline Marie has demonstrated in her leadership skills is when she brings in practices from other cultures, which I think is just such a great way to make a safe space and to really make people feel seen and heard. When we all met for this panel, we did the, I can't remember what it was called, the fireside or something. Yes, please help me.
It's the Aboriginal terms of reference that are utilised and were developed by Black Card Foundation in Australia.
Yes, thank you. And I thought that was excellent because it changed the way that we introduced ourselves, making it much more personal, a more level playing field. And for people from that background, that's very validating. And that's just an example of something you can do. But that can also extend to making, for example, information available on social media platforms that are more popular in different cultures and languages, to making it, making sure that there are language translations available, and also showing, like, how do I word this nicely? My articulation has left me, but also showing that they kind of like, everyone belongs in this space, which can be as simple as advertising materials showing that you have people from different backgrounds and so on, because that's a really big thing. If people see you as a white organization or something, not feeling that they fit in there. So there's a lot of small tangible things that you can do. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. John, were you raising
I was
your hand?
waving to you, but I'm happy to speak as well. Madeline Marie, thank you. Look, I really appreciate the comments around this. It's so important. And we can do it by looking around the room and asking who's not here. Sometimes that's the key for us to ask that, who's not here. So the students who are online, why are they online? The people who aren't in the room. Western Sydney University has done it brilliantly by knowing its own area and by putting that name at the front of its name. I think that's really very significant. There's a limit to what you can do as a teacher in that space though, because you have who's in the class. And similarly, as an executive, you tend to manage with the resources you've got. I cannot but encourage people to take up opportunities where they exist for governance engagement. Get onto the boards and the committees. It used to be assumed that governance was disconnected from organisations, but certainly recent Royal Commissions have said no. The culture of organisations is shaped fundamentally by the boardroom. What it endorses and what it permits is what the institution becomes. And if we can get people on boards, then we can make change. So as a person who spends a lot of time in that space, that's the kind of question I want to ask. There are some dangers because we can be tokenistic. You know, we say to Nguyen, who's on the school board, so what does the Asian community think? Well, that's just not fair. But hopefully by having Nguyen on the board, we remember there is an Asian community and we become attentive to that community. And so we move beyond tokenistically including to sort of humanizing the whole community that we seek to represent. And I think we, frankly, the same with students on college and university boards. If we ask a student to speak for the students, it's fundamentally unfair. But if we value them for their humanness, for their insight, for their wisdom, for their experience, then we really get somewhere. And that's when we start to see a revaluing of all people in organisations. End of my little rant.
No, thank you, John. I think that's a really important point. And it's even, you know, one of my pet peeves is when we talk about the student voice. And, you know, there is no single, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, there is no single student voice. It's not, you know, one distinct, you know, community where everyone thinks the same. Just like us around this metaphorical table that we have today, we all come from very different backgrounds and have different perspectives, and that's amazing, and that adds a lot of richness and robustness to the conversation. Now, I'm just very conscious of time. I know in the chat too, Sally, two particular mantras are coming to mind for you mind sharing them with our colleagues?
You're on mute. Just the one that started, I think, in the disability sector, which is nothing about us without us. So, you know, that's always a mantra I have in the back of my head. Very wrong for everyone to impose solutions, as well intentioned and as well conceived as they might be, without including the people who are seeking you, who need to be included. And the other one, which which I heard first from Sandy O'Sullivan, though I know it's Sandy O'Sullivan, who's an Indigenous academic, who's just got a future fellowship from the University of Sunshine Coast. You can't be what you can't see. So, and I've felt that very keenly all the way through, and both in professional and personal life as well. You know, there's juggling that parents have to do, and which has become quite apparent in the COVID situation, trying to juggle everything and do homeschooling and extra care, and even trying to understand how you even get to the shops and what that looks like. If you don't have models, and Brooke went there, just as I typed them up, Brooke, and put them on the chat, you actually were saying it out loud, is what I thought. So anyway, so I thought, you know, I know mantras are always trite and don't actually often get you very far, but sometimes it's good to have them sort of as conscience persuaders in the back of your head.
No, thank you. Thank you. And so I'm thinking final thoughts from our fantastic panelists. What is one piece of advice that you would have for those who wish to be an advocate and a leader of inclusive practices as well? Brooke, are you fine if we start with you first?
Sure, I was just thinking of something. I think the biggest thing is definitely bringing up everyone around you from different backgrounds, from different areas, and recognizing different types of brilliance and different types of values and valuable experiences, valuable skills, and really bringing that up with you. And don't think that leadership doesn't start at, you know, chancellors and being the president or anything like that. Even if you're just a classmate who needs to encourage someone on your group project, or a student leader who wants their shy friends to get involved or something like that, starting at those really small areas will always snowball and will always kind of make a difference for that person. And that's my experience, and I'm sure it can reach out to others quite sufficiently.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good piece of advice in terms of situating leadership not as a role per se, but more so as an action, as something that we practice every day, whether in our personal or professional lives. How about you, John? Any last pearls of wisdom that you would like to share?
Sure. Having talked about positional leadership in a way in terms of governance, I actually want to say I think the dilemma is that the position is rarely where the impact happens. It's in the relationships. There's often more leadership happens, as it were, on the shop floor than in the boardroom, but we need to model it in both places. It's about listening and hearing other people's stories, and more than just hearing them, being attentive and taking them on board and asking what we can learn. I've learned a lot more from particularly one of my daughters, who challenges me at all sorts of points, than I probably have from so many formal relationships. And that's the key, I think. People who hold us accountable, but also encourage us. That's the art. If we don't stop enough, we don't laugh and we don't cry enough. And if we don't laugh and cry with people, we don't really know them.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. And moving over to Sally, what's some final thoughts from yourself?
So my final thought was going to be pretty much the same as Brooke's, about you can exercise leadership and inclusive leadership wherever you are, whatever your role, by just living it and doing the joining up and the linking and the promoting and the reacting, because that just seems to me to be infinitely more satisfying about how you go about your business of life and career, and gives you a strong sense of moral purpose, I think, which can sustain you through all the very noisy noise that's around at the moment. I mean, some people might call it keeping yourself nice, but it's essentially acting unto others as you would like them to act unto you. But I now feel as though I need to expand on that, because it was just what Brooke said, and to a large extent also what John said. So I suppose just 3 quick points. Building patient capital. None of this stuff happens quickly, so you've got to be patient about it. And even if you didn't get it done or promoted, or you didn't get as far as you wanted to the first time, keep coming back to it if it's the right thing to do. It is hard work, you know, so if you're not interested in hard work, you know, that's a bit of that's unfortunate, because it is. And one of the things that I've often used to persuade colleagues in this is what works for the diversity cohorts or diversity or inclusion usually is of benefit to the mainstream. If there is such a complete disjunct between diversity and mainstream, which I'm not sure that there is anymore. And I think we saw that in COVID. I mean, disadvantage and was pretty much mainstreamed over the whole COVID situation. So, you know, be patient. It is hard work, but it's rewarding work that will sustain you. And what you do well in that area will be good for everybody and perhaps make us nice.
Thank you so much, Sally. And last but not least, the wonderful human that is James, what's one piece of advice that you would have?
Look, I think, you know, again, if I can give 3 bits. One is leadership is in our actions, not in our position title. And that's inclusive leadership. So again, picking up on the other speakers. 2 is that you should never, again, picking up on what about nothing about us without us. You know, if you're a researcher, you should never, or you're an educator, you should never be delving into spaces without including those who you're talking about or researching or discussing. And 3, it's about trust. It's about building trustful relationships, and that also builds on what Sally said, which was about the long term. And trust is about being open, being honest, and never, you know, never over promising what you're not going to be able to deliver. Being honest with your deliver, saying this is my capacity. This is what I can do. This is what we can do together. This is what we can achieve. And you're better off being really honest and saying, you know, I'm just one small increment in hopefully a bigger story, than promising the world and delivering very little. So that's what I think the essence of trust is, that transparency and honesty.
Fantastic. A big thank you to John, Sally, James and Brooke. Thank you all so much for your time and for all of your insights. Just via the chat feature, I'm just resharing the link to the page, which included the abstract of today's session, but which also includes the LinkedIn contact details of our fantastic panelists. And they very kindly shared those details so that you're more than welcome to reach out to them if you've got any other questions. But thank you so much. I think, you know, myself...
Well, Marie, can I cut across you? We really need to hear from you what your insight is, because you've been sitting in the space. What's your one word of advice about inclusion for leaders?
I think to me, it's very much about practicing what you preach and being very open for people to provide you with feedback and constructive criticism on ways that you can improve so that you can create that inclusive environment. And sometimes, you know, whether it be doing like just a practical strategy, doing walking meetings, meeting for coffee, those types of environments where you're taken out of that traditional kind of meeting setting, and I got this piece of advice from Brooke back in the day, of stepping away from your desk where it's such a place of power, and trying to connect at more of that human level, which was a real resonant theme from all of the advice that you fantastic humans shared with us.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so thank you once again to all of our panelists. You're more than welcome to stay as well. Our next session, which I see Kate should be here. Sorry, Kate Fitzgerald. So Kate, myself and Brooke are going to be discussing, the session title is In Conversation with Three Imposters, but I'm sure that a lot of us feel like imposters. So we definitely encourage in this next session as well for you to share your own experiences if you feel comfortable, but also to ask us questions as well. So a big round of applause firstly to all of our panelists. Thank you.